ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. What this panel will do is to sort of analyze objectivity in perceptions around China. I mean, I must say that's really not an easy task, as it were. If one were to ask that question today, given the circumstances. But I must congratulate Media Rumble, the team, for asking the panel to think about a very important and pertinent topic such as this. The question I think we are trying to answer today is an important one. From foreign policy to journalism, how objective or unbiased is China's perception in the world? Let me put it very, very, very bluntly and simply. We may or may not have issues with China. We may or may not like China, but we certainly cannot ignore China. China, by a lot of accounts, is on its way to becoming a superpower. So there is no way we can ignore that and the perceptions that we may have about China. So some introspection is probably a good idea. So it is important to understand China. So the question is, as the Media Rumble team has posed to us, is our understanding of China biased, unbiased, and are we trying enough to understand China and its people? So since we have only 40 minutes with four very distinguished panelists, we will do away with the initial remarks. I'll pose some thematic questions to the panelists and sort of get their views, and then we'll have about 10 minutes or so for question and answers. Let me sort of begin with you, Professor Raja Mohan. A 2020 14-country Pew Research Center survey shows that the views of China have grown more negative in recent years. An unfavorable opinion has soared over the past year. Today, a majority in each of the surveyed countries has an unfavorable opinion of China. And in Australia, the United Kingdom, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, United States, Canada, etc., negative views have reached their highest points since the Pew Research Center has begun polling on this topic more than a decade ago. How do you explain such unpopularity of an emerging superpower? Professor Raja Mohan.
No, the last few years, certainly under Xi Jinping, there's been a dramatic change of international perceptions. And that's not surprising because at least some clear ways in which Chinese influence has manifested itself. To summarize what Peter said, there is territorial expansionism, there is military assertion, there is economic coercion, there is diplomatic aggression, and domestic repression. I mean, if you see all these features, have become much worse under Xi Jinping. And you don't have to be a China scholar. You're right. The awareness of China in the Indian media is limited. We still can't get the first names and last names right. So Levin Jinping can still be said in our media. So that doesn't mean what you know. You don't. A good peasant knows repression when he sees it, when he finds expansionism. So there's no difficulty. I think while there is a general problem that we need to raise the level of awareness of China and its transformations that are taking place, but the basic features of a more aggressive China are out there for everyone to see. And that's the reason why across the world, there is a significant deterioration of the perceptions of China. And then we've seen hegemons before. The Americans, if you say Europeans, they'll talk about the Germans. You can talk about the Japanese in Asia. We've seen a lot of hegemons before. But I think China's rise has been much swifter, more dramatic, and a more dramatic change in the attitudes of China to the rest of the world, and a sense that they can get away with it, which is, I think, unfortunate. But the Chinese will discover, I think, just as they have nationalism pretty deeply rooted in Asia in particular. So they will be pushed back. It could be weakest countries, but everyone is going to push back. And China's nationalism is not exceptional. And therefore, Chinese, I think, have asked for it, and I think they're going to pay for it.
Thank you. Samir, sort of let me bring that question to you from a slightly different angle. Do we understand China enough? Now, let me explain what I mean by that. China clearly controls how its its people see the world by controlling the social media and the traditional media. But does the party's tight control of the news emanating from China also indirectly shape how we understand that country? And how do we sort of get past this carefully choreographed image of China? You've been a journalist, you sort of reported from China. What's your sort of take on that?
First of all, good evening, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'd like to speak from the point of view of an Indian journalist and an Indian woman journalist who happened to spend a year in Beijing in 2019. And I think at a fundamental level, if I can make a broader point, we have to understand the amount of resources we've actually put in when it comes to newsrooms, sending foreign reporters around the subcontinent versus the one-person bureaus that we send out to Beijing. China is a much, much bigger country, and I am not entirely sure as Indian newsrooms, we actually put in enough resources to understand and expand, I suppose, the foot soldiers on the ground for our understanding. Secondly is a gendered lens. Currently, every journalist, Indian journalist reporting out of Beijing is a man. And therefore, with that comes a specific kind of point of view on the country, be that a bilateral frame through which the country is seen. Perhaps it is what the foreign ministries are talking about each other and so on. The more bigger question here is language. So while we've done a great job understanding the subcontinent, one thing that really restricts us from going further is Mandarin. Learning Mandarin, understanding Mandarin, and therefore being in a position to walk up on the street to anyone, like you do in journalism, show up to any place and ask questions. That's impossible unless you know the language. I'd say our understanding is not enough. I think Indian newsroom should make a much bigger sort of push to send more people there. What I tried to do in my time there was to steer clear of what I thought was a very, bilateral frame. By that, I mean, I spent most of my time there trying to explain China, Chinese culture and society from the point of view of the Chinese. I even tried to not give you a reference to India. Let's go beyond that. And if I have to just explain to you how China looks. Is it difficult? Definitely. It was very hard. Most of my reporting was restricted to English-speaking Chinese people. There was no access to politicians or bureaucrats. That's impossible. There's a huge squeeze on information. And their version of journalism fundamentally is different to ours. So sometimes when you ask a question, it is like, but why is this even a question? Because you're clearly looking beyond, what they think is how we see the world. And I think the problem we make, or the nuance we completely miss in Indian journalism, or anywhere for that matter, is we tend to conflate the CCP with the Chinese people. This is like saying India is the Indian government. And I think that's really inaccurate, and it's a very narrow way of looking at it. So I think, like Mr. Peter Ramel said at the beginning, there are different versions of China that we should spend time understanding. And that's beyond just the government, beyond just the actual, geopolitical version of the country. And I think a lot more needs to be done, at least in our understanding from India, on how we see even similarities between the two. So that's my limited point.
Right. So I think that's an interesting point. I mean, the whole question of the choreographed image that the CCP has presented about China for the rest of the world. How do we sort of get past that? Samir, let me sort of bring that to you. Do we understand, one, China enough? And two, how do we get past this sort of carefully choreographed image of China?
Happymon, I am a little more worried today than I was a year ago, or maybe a couple of years ago. I am beginning to see the Chinese choreography extend to even external public spheres. So I'm not even sure that it is just the Chinese people who they are curating now, but see their control over FT, New York Times, Washington Post, and all the big media and university systems and journals, etc. We are seeing China curate its understanding for the world even in external territories. So I am not sure you are going to get an unadulterated view even outside China. And I think that's the new challenge that has come up. Xi Jinping is not just content in managing his own ecosystem. He wants to manage yours as well. So even if you were to engage on Chinese issues outside China, I suspect it might still be the Chinese dance you're performing. And I think that's the new additional challenge we face when we seek to study China or have an objective conversation on China. I think Chinese conversations are generally biased in favor of China due to their immense clout, reach, and socialization of key institutions globally. The Chinese have a saying, borrow a boat to go out to the sea. I guess they have borrowed all our boats and we are all at sea. I think that's the 2020 scenario that I think the 2020s is presenting to us. So that's one part of it. How do we really get to the truth? How do we have an objective conversation? How do we talk to folks without biases or prejudices about an actor who's very difficult to ignore or should not be ignored, like you mentioned in your opening remarks. You may like them, you may dislike them, but they are your reality. And for India, they are our neighbor. So they are a reality which is up close and personal. So that's one part of it. The second is that I think there is also a bit of a binary divide in those who want to study China and those who think it is not important to invest in that study. I think there's a divide here. And I'll tell you what the divide is. The divide is that somehow there is a notion, and I want to dispel this notion. Somehow there is a notion that if you study China, you're trying to normalize their deviant behavior. And I think this must be dispelled. Even if you think China is your enemy and is going to be inimical to your interests, it is even more important to study them. So in fact, if you see them as a danger, if you see them as a threat, if you see them as harming your interests, if you see them as expanding their political territories to your cost, if you see them amassing 100,000 troops on your northern borders summer after summer, I think it becomes even more of an imperative to spend more money in understanding the nature of the beast. So I think we must dispel this idea that study China means normalize China. I think study China is also a strategic tool that is extremely vital if you need to develop a comprehensive response to a relentless, expansive neighbor who is nibbling away at your multiple fronts, digital, territorial, water, maritime. So you have to engage. It is a strategic imperative. It is not a jhola wala imperative that let's study China because it's fashionable. I think it is an existential necessity for a country like India to invest in understanding someone who's standing at the gates. So that's the second part. And final point, Happymon, in my opening thoughts, is that and when we decide to study China, I think we have to understand there are two important, and there are many nuances, but two important nuances to keep in mind. One is long-termism and one is short-termism. I think the study has to have both elements of it. You have a serial killer in town. You can't do a long paper before you respond to the serial killer, right? It is important to study why someone chose a certain path in life, why they became like that, where do they come from, what were the conditions that led them to become who they are. And that's a very interesting and important study to do. But there is also a short-term and tactical study that responds to the immediate. I think I don't have to understand China when they have 100,000 troops standing on my border. I have to find a response to that 100,000 troops. And there is a tactical dimension of studies. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are the divisions within? What are the forces and drivers and generals and individuals who are driving that formation? So there is a short-term and tactical study and research that must go into China, which we don't do, by the way, which we must do. And there is a longer-term study to understand the neighbor who you are going to live together, whom you are. And by the way, China is becoming so expansive that Berlin and Beijing are now border towns. So, I mean, they have taken their reach to the borders of Europe. And in that sense, all of us need to study that more. And I think, therefore, there are two studies which are important. One, I would say, is through much greater media proliferation, much greater academic proliferation, much greater strategic proliferation into various aspects of the Chinese state. And then there is a longer social, cultural, historical, and more strategic assessment of a long-term neighbor, partner, enemy, foe, however you want to describe China. And I think these need to be brought together to understand.
That's absolutely well said, Samir. In fact, I can draw a parallel to our understanding of Pakistan here as well. I mean, in India, everyone is a Pakistan expert, but the reality is that how many universities and how many institutes have dedicated Pakistan studies divisions? How many of them understand the internal politics in Pakistan? And the moment you start, studying Pakistan, there is this feeling that, oh, you're normalizing Pakistani behavior. I think you sort of hit the nail on the head when you said, understanding China, studying China is not equal to normalizing Chinese behavior. I think that needs to be underlined and emphasized. But Bill, let me sort of come to you next. I was reading about this internal report circulated by the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, which gave a grave warning to Chinese leadership. According to reports, apparently it concluded that global anti-China sentiment is at its highest since the 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown. Now, China, therefore, clearly is not oblivious to the rising anti-China feelings, and yet there seems to be little course correction in CCP or in China. If anything, there seems to be more aggression. What, in your sort of understanding, explains this sort of contradiction, as it were?
Yeah, look, Australia, for those who have been paying attention, has had a huge falling out with China in recent years. And just 5-6 years ago, Australia was signing a free trade agreement. Universities were getting closer and closer with research funding. And the two biggest political donors to Australian politicians were two Chinese property billionaires. So that gives you an idea of just how close Australia was getting to China 5 or 6 years ago, maybe about 7-8 years ago, probably. But these days, relations are very fraught. And the main reason probably is that Australia is locking in more closely in its traditional alliance with the United States. And of course, China has an objective to, over time, push the US out of East Asia. But the other reason is that Australia has become very savvy about how the Chinese party state works. There are a lot of journalists, a lot of scholars, a lot of analysts who regularly write about this. There has been a very lively debate in Australia. Often you have the business community who wants close ties to China for economic reasons. But then you now have increasing voices of national security analysts and people who are very aware of how the Chinese party state seeks to influence democratic politics overseas, particularly in the Chinese diaspora community. So for that reason, the Australian government has taken a few measures in recent years to try and offset that sort of Chinese interference. And that has really been taken very badly by Beijing, which has targeted Australian exports and various other measures in response. So, how's the Australian public seeing all this? The current attitudes towards China are very poor over here. People are very unhappy with how Beijing has been treating Australia in recent years, and I can't see relations getting any better. And it's not just Australia, it's obviously something that people in India are very familiar with, and many other countries in the region.
It so appears that they probably haven't learned lessons from the other superpowers. I mean, if you look at the US example, the US has, tried to improve its image abroad, even while it sort of, did things that it shouldn't have been doing. I mean, that's been the example. But the Chinese state certainly hasn't learned that logic. But let me come to you, Professor Raja Mohan, with a slightly different question. I mean, taking on from what Samir said. Professor Raja Mohan, you've been a teacher, a journalist, a commentator. You watched China for a very long time. How do you sort of assess the state of China studies in India or even in places like Singapore? I mean, you are in Singapore these days. So do we study China enough in India? I mean, this is, again, picking up from what Samir said. I think that's an interesting and important question that needs to be addressed.
No, compared to where I was when I joined the School of International Studies in '74, there's a lot more people studying China today. In India, I'm talking about. So there is actually the number of people who can speak Mandarin in India, who spend time in China, coming back and working as professionals in India. So there's a lot more knowledge about China in that sense, a lot more awareness. Otherwise, even right till the turn of the millennium, you had one visit to China and say, I went to China, this is what I saw. This type of nonsense, we were, as if it was some curiosity, you managed to go there, you saw cycles going everywhere, that kind of stuff. We romanticized a lot of that. But today there is no shortage of knowledge. That does translate into the mass media? No. In fact, again, if I go back to my period of growing up, there were more correspondents for every newspaper in every corner of the world than there are today. A Hindu, for example, had Pallavi Iyer, who was a female. You had a lot more journalists posted abroad. But for the media, revenue model has changed. They don't much. And globalizing India devotes a lot less attention to paying foreign reporters. So I think that is a paradox. But I think that has changed. So, and the problem you identified, look, there is no expertise in terms of, there is a shortage of expertise on all regions. There's Latin America, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. We've not invested enough, but China is too large. So whether you invest or not, China is going to affect you in a manner that Latin America might not. So in some senses, that is that. But China is the second largest economy. So more people are engaging with it. So more people are picking up stuff. Indians working in China. There is a lot more exchanges today in spite of the other problems. But I want you to caution against one thing. Expertise does not translate into good policy or good judgment. If expertise is all that you needed, the US won't have messed it up in Middle East, in Afghanistan, after blowing up $5 trillion, that you still get it wrong. With all the massive industry of IR, think tanks, knowledge, no other country has as many Arabic speakers, as many people who are familiar with the Middle East than the US, but yet you screw it up. So I think having expertise and knowledge and good policy are not the same things. So there are a whole lot of other things. We should also differentiate between understanding a society, which is really investing in its history, culture, civilization, language, and the other, the state and public policy is immediately focused on what are the issues at hand. What is China doing on your borders? How is China's India trade deficit? Where is it taking you? So those are live issues. So it's not that one is exclusion of the other. We have to invest in both. So my sense is, I don't think we should worry too much. I think we need to put in more effort, and the media in particular needs to devote a lot more attention to what's happening in the world. And as I said, the more we globalize, the less we are interested in the world. And there are simplifications that are sold. And then you have the electronic media, which is just, dumbing down everything to a level where actually no reasonable discourse. Right. That's the problem, not how many experts do we have. I think that is the issue I think we have today.
Right. Before I go to Sowmiya on the question of reporting China once more, Samir, I sort of want to come back to once again, picking up the point that you made early on in the discussion about sort of studying China. You had one of the leading think tanks in India, and what has been your own experience or that of the Observer Research Foundation in sort of studying China, the nuances of its politics or dissidence or culture? What has been your experience?
So, Happymon, I agree with Dr. Raja Mohan from a very narrow think tank perspective. I think more people are studying China in think tanks today than they ever were. Let's be honest here. And not only China, but China and gender, China and tech, China and commerce, China and their rural development models. In fact, I remember 7 years ago, sending a delegation of 6 or 7 of my researchers to 3 villages in China to see and doing a comparative study with Uttarakhand and certain other rural habitats in India. So I think we are doing more than we ever did, and that's true. I am not certain that what we do is necessarily being received by those who make policies vis-a-vis China. So I think there is also a knowledge gap between the production of knowledge and its application to create sensible policies. And I think Dr. Raja Mohan is right that having knowledge and expertise does not necessarily mean that you come up with the right policy responses. And I think in China, we are still, again, even at the political and policy level, we are still caught in the binaries. Either you're a panda hugger, the Indian version of it, or you see them as a existential threat. And we still have not right-sized China. I think Ambassador Rosgotra many years ago, when we were sitting in a research meeting at ORF, once pointed to one of our young fellows and said, "Listen, they are not 6 feet, but they are not 100 feet either. So get the size right when you scope the dimensions of that particular challenge." So that's one part. But let me tell you, Happy, when I joined ORF, we had no Chinese speaking scholar. We have 3 today, right? And we have a larger constellation of external contributors who speak Chinese, and we commission papers, commission research, reach out to. We have a network of many of those who watch China. In fact, if you go to our website, you will find a lot of Chinese researchers who have contributed to our own understanding of the trade debates, the RCEP debates, even on thorny questions like BRI and Afghanistan, etc. So I think we are certainly doing more on China. And I think in many ways, I suspect what happened in the Himalayas last year is a good opportunity for all of us to devote far more resources on another neighbor. And I see this as something that is already beginning to happen, Happymon. So I think think tanks in India are definitely investing more. And we have, for me, if you say I'm a China expert, I speak Mandarin, I give you a job even before I know anything else. So no, it's like that. You tell me I speak Mandarin and I want to study China, I say, come join us, right? And if you know 5,000 characters, you can be my boss also. So I'm very happy. I understand that you have to engage with this very important neighbor. And this is true for many institutions. That's the first part. The second is that I also think we face a very interesting, what do I say? A bottom line challenge. Once you know a bit of Chinese and once you understand a bit of that continent or the society or peoples, the private sector is going to grab you. The returns that the private sector and commercial enterprises give to Chinese speakers in terms of salaries and fees and remuneration is very difficult for us to compete with if you are in a media house or in a think tank or even in a modest, small strategic analysis firm. So I think we are also, even as our relationships become more thorny, our economic integration remains top-notch in terms of India's global footprint. So in that sense, the commercial owners are going to gobble up the talent that we produce, and we are not producing sufficient. So in a sense, the globalizing India is globalizing in terms of its business interests and its economic interests, not necessarily creating the strategic heft to understand the world it plays in. And I think, therefore, we require a far greater pool of resources so that it can cater to the commercial as well as the research and media interests that should be devoted to China. Sorry, it's a long answer to a short question.
No, but thank you. But let's try and sort of get into the nitty-gritties of understanding and reporting China a little more. And I want to bring in Sowmiya and Bill here. Sowmiya, tell us about how hard is it reporting from China? How free are foreign journalists when it comes to reporting from inside China? Do you get unfettered access to individuals, especially those with a critical view? What about access to places like Tibet and Xinjiang?
I'm speaking definitely from the year I spent there, and I'm sure Bill can weigh in for a much longer stint in China. It's definitely hard. Everything goes through an official channel. If you want access to any kind of politician or bureaucrat, it has to be on email or a written sort of transcript sent to them saying this is the clear question. Beyond that, I think what we saw last year was a good example. A whole bunch of American journalists were asked to leave in a week or 10 days. A lot of them packed up very quickly, moved to Seoul, moved to Taiwan, went back to the States. Some of them are actually here in India, in Delhi. So there is, knee-jerk reactions that are then aimed at journalists, especially foreign journalists. because they provide a different narrative to the way the world sees China. And whether you have access to Tibet and Xinjiang, much more difficult. I'm sure Bill can talk more about this. While I was there, I tried reporting on the protests in Hong Kong and was not allowed. And when I went on holiday there, I was told very clearly by other journalists to not record or take images on my phone, which might be checked when I'm coming back into the mainland. So I think there is a sense of, I think the unknown in a bit of how this will be received, because I come from a context of the Indian press where things are a bit more, free. I have access to bureaucrats and politicians, but that's not really the case there. And so there is also the visa being hung over your head. If you do any wrong in their eyes of a bad reporting, then you've been asked to leave. So I think definitely things are getting harder, and they're really squeezing information from that perspective.
You were asking about Tibet. No, I mean, that's off limits to foreign journalists unless they are taken in on a government media trip. So I was never able to go there. Xinjiang is, you're able to fly into Xinjiang, but you're pretty much followed from not long after you arrive. So there's a heck of a lot of police and undercover interference in Xinjiang. Just one thing I suppose I'd add. One of the problems now reporting in China is that the Chinese education system is incredibly effective at fostering nationalism. And I am stunned just by how nationalistic China has become, particularly in recent years under Xi. I obviously have an Australian outlook. We're not particularly nationalistic down here, but it is just in-your-face nationalism promoted through media, through digital media, through things like apps. There are patriotic videos playing on the subways in Beijing every now and then. It just becomes normalized, of course, the education system too. And so being such a sort of nationalistic country, foreign journalists have been completely stigmatized by the government. And there is a default understanding in China that the foreign media lies and is out to get China. And so any reporting that the foreign media does about China, the default position of many people you come across is, no. I don't care what you say, you're foreign media, of course you're out to smear China. The government actively promotes this idea. It's not dissimilar if you look at US elections and the Donald Trump supporters, the way many of them completely dismiss the mainstream media, no matter what it says about the Trump, Mr. Trump. It's very similar sort of idea. So from a starting point, this makes engagement very difficult. It makes working as a journalist in China incredibly difficult. And you just have to understand the Chinese state has been incredibly successful at normalizing this idea from the outset that foreigners, foreign media are not to be trusted. They're out to get China. It's such a negative way for China to engage with the world. But unfortunately, that's the starting point. And when you get something like the border clashes between India and China, whatever the Indian media says, people in China just straight off go, well, of course they'd say that. It's the Indian media. They're out to smear China. We don't care what they say. So I don't know if it was always like this. Of course, it's always been rather patriotic under communism. But in recent years, I've been on the ground there and you've just seen it ramp up. It is really, really noticeable.
Right. Professor Raja Mohan, it is easy for the United States or UK or India and other big countries to sort of dismiss the Chinese sort of mega project, the BRI initiative. But how is it viewed in, say, less developed or developing countries? Put differently, is the view of China uniformly shared across states, let's say, barring close strategic allies such as Pakistan, or is there a divide in the international community about how China is viewed?
I think the divide is not between developed or developing countries or The divide is between elites and ordinary people. I mean, that what Chinese have been enormously successful, I mean, Chinese state, in elite capture. That is, you can call it influence operations, you can call buying foreign leaders, you can say corrupting foreign leaders, that it can use, funding, building presidential palaces, giving cuts on, project money. So they've done it, enormously in the last 20 years. So you have, even in Pakistan, where the Pakistani army says CPEC is a game changer, Imran Khan himself, before he became prime minister, was raising questions about CPEC. He's saying, look, it's not too effective. Even today in Pakistan, there is a debate, if you care to notice, that's part of a lack of our Pakistan studies, that actually on the ground, the reactions against what China does, its projects, we've seen it in Burma, we've seen it in large parts of Africa. So there is elite capture. So if you are a Ruritania, you are a king, and you say, look, the Chinese give you better terms for the elite, not for the country. He'll say, look, fine. I mean, they're not giving me lectures on human rights. They're giving me money. I can use it for my own ends, and I'm fine. But somebody is paying the price. I mean, if you're willing to pay more interest rate to a Chinese project, you get into a debt trap. But it is somebody behind me is going to take care of it. And I think that we've seen across the board. Even the most friendliest states to China, we've seen reactions at the ground level. But is it strong enough to translate into resistance? No. But in some places, yes. But we've seen in Burma, where the Haidel projects, there was a lot of resistance. There was pushback. Projects were suspended. But today, when Burma is isolated by the West, they're going to go back to the Chinese. So I think it's a dynamic interaction. But at the mass level, there have been protests because Chinese don't generate employment. They bring their own people. And the condescension. I mean, we're not the only racists in the world, and the Americans are not the only racist one. The Chinese are quite famous for it too. I mean, the way they treat brown and black people, I mean, it's pretty, and in Pakistan, we've seen video footage how they treat the local people. So I think money brings arrogance, and sense of cultural superiority also brings arrogance. And Chinese have all those problems. I think the difference between the Americans and their previous hegemon, shall we say, in the US, there is a recourse to alternative sources, like the state. Okay, you heard the American president, you can say he's an idiot. You can go to the Congress, you can go to the media, you can go to opposition parties. In China, there's no recourse. So that's why it's enough to say, look, CPC must be separated from the rest of the society. But CCP has dominated the state, leaves no room. Look, I've been traveling to China since the late 80s. Even 10 years ago, 5 years ago, you could travel far more in a relaxed fashion. You could talk to the academics privately, they would say a lot of things. And Samir and I, we have traveled. We've dealt with Hu Jishin, who is the Global Times editor. He came to RF. We went there, and you could have a reasonable conversation with them. China has changed. I mean, I think if you don't notice that, look, China has fundamentally changed. Chinese state, its behavior has changed under Xi Jinping because they think they've arrived, they have the clout, right, and the others have no alternative but to accept the dominance. And I think that's a reality, and I think people are dealing with it.
Sure. I think we have to now move to the Q&A. There is this very interesting question now. Professor Raja Mohan just mentioned about the CCP, but I'm going to take that question to either Samir or Sowmiya. Is the dictatorship of the CCP the only hurdle because of which other countries hesitate to engage with China? In other words, say there is a regime change in China. Will China be sort of different towards the world? Will the world be different towards China? I think that's a larger philosophical question. But do you want to give it a try, Samir? I mean, say from Indian perspective, I mean, is it the CCP that's the problem? Is it China that's the problem?
See, I think let me quote Ambassador Vijay Gokhale here. And he says, like in Pakistan, the army has a state. In China, the party has a state. And I think to create a cleavage between them, the party and the state, means changing the nature of the beast completely. And I think this then becomes just a moot point. The question that we need to ask is that, are we going to see a dramatic change in the character of the CPC itself? And I think that's the question to ask. That that will the CPC, and I think Peter mentioned it in his opening comments, that are we going to see a dramatic change in the way CPC engages with the world, and is this only a Xi Jinping phenomenon? So are we going to see a different summer once Xi Jinping is no longer in charge? Or have we seen an irreversible move towards a muscular party that is hell-bent on using technology, media, enterprise, and politics and security for the benefit of the party agenda? And I think that's the question. That is the party agenda now so institutionalized and unshakable that only a disintegration of the political system of China can make it a responsible actor? Or do we still have a chance that the CPC itself evolves, like the Americans did, by the way, that itself evolves and becomes a far more reflective and engaged organization with the outside? I need to make one short point, Happymon. I think comparing Chinese hegemony and American hegemony is a false debate. Now, Americans have been brutal in the way they have destroyed civilizations. Let's be very clear. There used to be a country called Iraq, right? So they have been absolutely barbaric in conduct of foreign policy to defend further their own interests. Let's be very honest about it. But like Dr. Raja Mohan mentioned, and Ashley Tellis has famously coined, that America was a penetrated democracy. That although it was the hegemon and although it decided what it wanted to do around the world, you could go and stand outside the White House and raise slogans and ask for tobacco to be banned or firearms to be banned, or ask for anything. You could lobby their Congress, you could lobby their PR firms, you could create advocacy groups even from your own country. They allowed their own democracy to be penetrated by everyone. So while they were a global hegemon, their democracy was allowed to be gamed by every person. The Chinese gamed it the best. That's a separate topic. But they allowed their democracy to be gamed. Now, if you want to protest against a policy of Xi Jinping, where do you go and hold that placard? Where do I stand showing my disapproval for Xi Jinping policy? Who do I lobby for in China to get that policy changed of the Chinese for their approach to Afghanistan or oil or climate change? So I think unless China allows a framework where global criticism can reach it, and can engage with that, like the Americans did, the Chinese will always be a muscular state and will continue to see growing discordant voices against its presence. Right. If it is able to allow criticism to reach it and create the receptacles to have dialogues with those who disagree with it, then we will see that new CPC regime emerge. And I think that's the question we need to think about.
Right. Very quickly, Bill and Sowmiya, if you have any thoughts on this particular question about, you both have seen the people and you have dealt with the party inside China. Where do you stand on this particular question? The CCP or no CCP, China is going to be what it is, or is it going to be different?
I can weigh in really quickly, just about sort of a tangential point to taking a placard and protesting against the party itself. But if you just zoom out to see the nature of protests itself, those are happening. In the last year, I've been an Ashoka University fellow studying food delivery platforms in India and China, and have tracked in some detail protests from gig workers in China, which is quite rampant across several Chinese cities. So when the point I'm trying to make is that protests do happen for related issues, and the government does actually take those into account. And if it's gotten into a point that it cannot be contained, it even does affect policy. So one I can think of is gig workers in the food delivery sector, environmental protests as well, and the use of the internet basically to express dissent. I think we're under the impression that a lot of Chinese people do not have anything to say against their government, but there is a very, counterculture that is apparent and is completely taking over the internet in many phases. Perhaps we don't know how to read that because we are not from the same culture, but I think it's important to point out people are calling out the government in various ways.
Right. Thanks, Bill. Any thoughts on that particular question?
Oh, yeah, just quickly to add that even though the Chinese government appears to be trying to make public discussion in China as uniform as possible. It's very much, as Samir said, there's a lot more bubbling under the surface. But at the end of the day, for other countries and the way that they engage with China, how much does that really matter when you have civil society groups that now really can't have foreign links because of a foreign NGO law, which prohibits NGOs receiving foreign funding and things like that. If you're another country and you're trying to deal with China, you do have this massive problem where the government does have such an iron grip on, all facets, including civil society. Maybe 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it was easier to reach out to those various interest groups in China. These days, it's once again getting harder and harder.
Thank you.
Happy, just a quick intervention. I did not for a minute to imply that you don't have Chinese debates on their Chinese Twitter and on social media and on the platform. I think it's a very vibrant governance-related conversations, incidents, eve teasing, injustice, all sorts of issues are discussed on their own social media platforms. My question is, a global hegemon is not about Chinese discussions on their policies. A global hegemon requires international voices to be able to protest against the Chinese in China, in Beijing, standing before the court of Emperor Xi Jinping. And that is not there today. So I don't care what they do with their own citizens. But if I dislike Chinese policy, I don't have a recourse to it, unlike what, say, the Americans offered others when they were at the peak of their global power.
Fair enough. So, Professor Raja Mohan, very quickly, there's a very interesting question from Sanjana. How does the Chinese scholarship differ from, say, Asian scholarship or the Eurocentric perspectives on China? Is there a prevalent narrative that exists both in the media and research? I know it's a huge question, but if we can sort of...
I think to take the point where Sowmiya talked about, look, Chinese themselves list how many protests have taken place each year. There are thousands of them they list. The Internal Security Bureau constantly lists every year so many protests. Right now, Evergrande, the collapse of the big real estate company, people are saying, give me money back. So those kind of protests have been fairly common, but land, expansion of capital into agrarian land. These protests are well documented and studied. But if there is a professor in Beijing University who says, look, Xi Jinping is going crazy, he's trying to accumulate too much power, he's sacked. So I think, we got to differentiate at what level, the protests, are they consequential? Look, all repressive societies have humor, have these cat and mouse games on the internet. Winnie the Pooh can't be said, so people will find different ways of saying it. That is human beings constantly, reacting against state power. But the Chinese have, created a state today that is far more repressive. From people we've interacted with, academics who talk a lot more. 5 years ago, today they don't. Yeah. That is a change. And I think there is a repressive mode internally. And I think you're a political scientist. You say, look, democracies don't go to war. You say, because internally, there is counter positions and how the calculations go is more complicated. So I think Chinese have a problem, but I would finally agree with Sowmiya. China has politics. Those politics are not going to be repressed for too long. China has always had domestic politics. I don't think Xi Jinping is an emperor. He's abolished politics. There is a post-politics China. There is not. There will be politics. There will be contestation. And we're going to see, it's a matter of time when you will see the internal dynamic against the internal hegemon who's arrived.
Thank you, Professor Raja Mohan. We sort of, we just don't have any more time left to take any more questions. So I will basically say that I think we've had a fantastic discussion. I think what clearly comes out of this discussion, at least to my mind, is that if indeed there is a biased perspective about China in the world, that is also because of Chinese control of the media, of how, as Samir put it, they are not just controlling how their citizens think. They are also trying to control how the rest of the international community thinks about China. I think that's where really the problem is. But I think, again, as Professor Raja Mohan said, there is a study policy divide on China, right? You may do all kinds of studies on China, but does that necessarily translate into policy? And a view also echoed by Samir. But I think at the end of the day, this distinction that is made about state versus society, just because you have differences of issues with the difference of opinion with the Chinese Communist Party. Xi Jinping does not mean that you don't study China. I mean, that's all the more reason why you study China. As Samir put it so elegantly, if you have the enemy next door, you better know all about your enemy or adversary. I think so. There's all the more reason why our universities should study China more, and our think tanks like ORF is already doing, but should do more work on China, and our media personalities should go beyond mere shouting matches and try and understand the real China situation. But thank you so much, all of you, for joining this very interesting session.